Hello. Last time I was interviewed, I discussed how my fellow peers and I are preparing to become teachers at Hawaii Pacific University and some of the learning that's involved in this. And one of the topics I touched upon was how at HB we learn about the history and philosophy of education. And I'm doing this follow-up discussion now because a viewer had written an article expressing their disagreement to this, that teachers don't need to learn about the history or philosophies in regards to education. And I believe that being knowledgeable of the history and philosophy of education is essential for a teacher to be a true profession. And before I talk about why we should, as teachers, be knowledgeable of the history and philosophy of education, I want to address why someone may oppose this belief. So, it can be seen as a teacher's job to just teach a specific skill and knowledge base, not the history or philosophy of education. And due to this, teachers only need to know how to teach specific skills and knowledge to their students. And as a result to all of this, it can be seen as a waste of time for teachers to learn about the history and philosophy of education. And there is an issue with this argument, that being that teachers should know why they are teaching in the way that they are, and they should know why they are doing these things. And the answer to this question can oftentimes be found in the history or philosophy of education. So if you imagine that you had a child, or you do have a child, would you not want to know why your teacher or your child's teacher teaches in the way that they do? And if you were to ask that teacher what their philosophy on education is, and they said that they didn't know, or the question frustrates them, wouldn't this raise some eyebrows? Again, for teachers to be effective teachers, they need to know why they are teaching in the way that they do and why that method has been seen as beneficial. And oftentimes, a lot of this information and perspective can be found in the history and philosophy of education. Education has been around for a very long time, so in pre-literal society, for instance, education was oftentimes more of an enculturation system where the values, stories, poems, and other essentials would be exchanged through oral means, while in further along the timeline, ancient China, for instance, their education system was based around Confucius, which valued the ethics of hierarchy and responsibility. And in ancient Greece, there was many philosophers that came out of that time that shaped education to the way we have it today, such as Plato. And there are many pioneers in education and teaching throughout history. So many of these philosophers' ideas are still rooted in today's education, such as the method of systematic and sequential instruction. And later, if we look more specific at US history, during the colonial era, education was on a dual track system, so primary schools for the masses and then secondary school for males in the upper social economic classes. And there was a huge emphasis on the literacy of children. But after statehood, there was a move to a more public schooling system, and there was the creation of secondary education, so middle school and high school. And the US is also said to be a melting pot of diversity, and this diversity is also a factor in the changing of the education system. And this education system still continues to evolve. And the big picture here is that teachers need to learn about the history of education, as it allows teachers to know where education has been in the past and to versus where it is now. And it lets them know how education was shaped, and a lot of the concepts that we use in education has been concepts that were developed in the past. And most importantly, however, is the continued improvement and insight that we as teachers would take from the history of education, and we can build off of the knowledge from the past like a ratchet effect. So now, what is educational philosophy? Before I answer this question, what is philosophy? So philosophy is a systematic development of thoughts that build a generalized view of the world, and this can include a view of reality, logic, or values. Now, as educational philosophy, that is a personal statement by a teacher that highlights their principles about education in terms of how students' learning may be maximized, the role of education in the classroom or schools, or the community and society as a whole. There are several educational philosophies or guidelines that prospective teachers and teachers can incorporate into their educational philosophy. For instance, there is essentialism, where there is an emphasis on intellectual and moral standards transferred by the school. So the curriculum should be centered around knowledge and skill, along with social politics should not be an influence in the schooling system. Then there's existentialism. This is a subjective philosophy that encompasses the importance of individuals and emotional aspects of life. It also encourages that people can define themselves, and this can be through personal choice. Then there's progressivism, and here there's an emphasis on students rather than the subject matter. And there is also an emphasis on the importance of student interest to integrate it into their learning to overall improve their learning. And the overall idea is that schools should help students develop their personal and social values. And then there are other philosophies such as idealism, realism, pragmatic. Now this may seem off topic, but what makes teachers a profession? So it is debated whether or not teaching or teachers is a profession or not, and it has been argued that teaching is not a full profession yet. However, it is moving towards being a full or fuller profession. The essence of being a professional teacher is being knowledgeable and enthusiastic about the material that they teach, while also creating a supportive and respectful classroom environment. In addition to this, being well organized and being able to plan ahead while also remaining open to new ideas through continued learning. And part of being knowledgeable as a teacher is knowing and understanding some of the history of education and the philosophies that accompany education. And this background knowledge is what teachers use to establish their teaching method and ideology. So how is a professional teacher different from the teacher described by the opponent? The opposing side view teachers as their sole job to teach students a particular skill or knowledge set, and teachers who learned the history and philosophy of education were wasting their time, where in fact the history and philosophy of education gives teachers the background knowledge that they need to succeed. Understanding the history of education can help teachers understand the cultural implications that this history has had on education and how it has changed over time. In addition, knowing where education has started and where it is going allows teachers to know their stance in the education progression. While understanding the philosophy of education allows teachers to understand the different paths of learning that each philosophy brings. In addition to this, knowing the philosophy of education allows for teachers to understand their own teaching philosophy and the teaching philosophies of their co-workers. The opposing side also said that teachers only need to know how to teach specific skills and knowledge to their students. And while there are standards that students need to meet that are set by the state, the way in which this material that the teacher teaches can be taught to their students in different ways, and that can differ between their school system and the teacher's philosophies themselves and their understanding of the history of education. And all of this history of education and philosophy of education and all the other background knowledge that teachers learn helps them funnel all their information that they've learned to be better teachers to provide a more effective teaching and learning experience. In conclusion, knowing the history of education can allow us or teachers to reflect back on the past of education and know where it's been. This allows us to analyze where we are now in education, and it is also equally important in allowing us to build off of the past and the knowledge of others. As for philosophy, understanding the philosophy of education gives teachers a basic principle in which they use to determine the method of teaching they use and how that experience can be maximized to enhance student learning, and gives them insight of the philosophies of their co-teachers or their peers. And the whole goal of education is to teach students information and skills they need to succeed in the best possible way that we as teachers or prospective teachers can. And parents have the right to know what we or the teachers are doing to their children and why we are doing these things, and the only way or one of the only ways for a teacher to know why they are doing these things is by being knowledgeable of the history and philosophy of education.